Okay, so today we're going to be working on Chapter 8, which is on group influence. We'll be going through several different theories and concepts related to social psychology and how groups influence people. There's actually a lot of different sorts of ways that a group can influence people, both for good and for ill. And there's several factors that really influence how the effect of the group on an individual. So we're going to kind of try to unpack some of these. There's been a lot of research that's been done on this within social psychology for decades, and so we're just going to kind of look through some of these different sorts of things. Now, the first thing we're going to think about is just simply defining what is a group. There's been several different definitions of what a group is, but kind of the broadest and the one that's used in the textbook is that a group is two or more people who, for longer than a few moments, interact with and influence one another and perceive one another as us. It is difficult to know exactly what are the boundaries between a group and a non-group. Meaning, so for example, when someone's sitting in a computer lab with several different persons not interacting with each other, is that still a group? We do know that just simply being observed or in the presence of someone else can actually influence our behavior, but it's much more different when we begin to interact with those persons. And I think one of the important parts to notice with this particular definition is when we perceive one another as us. So it's one thing to be with a group of people, meaning having people in my general vicinity, but it's different when I begin to perceive that other person as a part of me, if you will, or that we are a part of some sort of group identity. And as we'll be looking and trying to understand throughout this chapter, is trying to think about how does that group identity really affect us? What kind of influence does it have on us? Groups can meet a lot of different sorts of needs. A lot of different sorts of needs. They can help us to affiliate, help us to achieve certain kinds of goals, and then of course the importance of our social identity. A large part of our identity is going to be determined by the types of groups that we are actually a part of. So when we look at kind of the first section on social facilitation, how are we affected by the presence of others? So we are affected by simply when someone else is around us. We are affected by a crowding, and crowding is when you have very large groups of people. So it's not just 5 or 6 people, but when you have a large crowd. How does that change the way that we think? And does that change certain kinds of behaviors? And then 2, one of the things that's kind of come to the forefront in terms of research on a group influence is the role of arousal, and how there is something really interesting that we become aroused to a certain extent when we're just in a group, meaning that our feeling states and a certain amount of pleasure too. Simply, we tend to get more excited when we're around other people. Being around other people energizes us, and that's what we mean by being aroused by. When you're with a group of people, there's a different energy that people can experience. That's what we mean by that type of arousal. So, social facilitation is the way in which groups can facilitate certain kinds of behaviors or attitudes. The original meaning was that social facilitation is the tendency of people to perform simple or well-learned tasks better when others are present. So when early on in the research, the original thought was, based on a few experiments, was that people will tend to perform better when others are present. And what they found later is that this isn't always the case. And if you think about kind of different situations, there's times when we're in the presence of others where we perform better, and there's times in the presence of others when we perform worse. And one of the things that's that we're going to be looking at is this idea of when we're in the presence of others, a common tendency is we tend to do better at stuff we're really good at, stuff that's well practiced. We tend to not do as good at things that we are just learning or not as good at. So that's going to be something to be thinking about. So the more current meaning in terms of social facilitation is that when we're around groups of people, it strengthens the dominant or the prevalent responses in the presence of others, meaning it tends to enhance, strengthen, or increase the current thoughts, attitudes, or behaviors of the persons we are currently with. And as we're going to, as we begin to unpack these things, we're going to see that there's a lot of different factors that come to play. So in many cases, others' presence boosts performance on easy tasks, but impairs performance on difficult tasks. So if you think about like when a basketball star is playing basketball, and when he's playing to the home crowd, there's a lot of evidence that shows that in general, most teams win more games at home than they do when they are visiting, meaning that there is something about performing in front of a group of people that are supporting you, but it's important. You have to be performing something that you're really good at. So for soccer players, basketball players, baseball players, those people who are excellent at sports, when they're in front of someone, it can actually help and increase their performance. Now, on the other hand, it can impair our performance on more difficult tasks. So when you think about like the first time you get up in front of a big crowd, or if you're trying to explain something new to a group of persons, most of the time our performance drops because we're doing something that we're not as comfortable with, that's not as practiced, and so it takes a lot more time to learn those tasks well, and thus to actually get that increase in performance that you feel when you're around other kinds of persons. So the basic route that occurs is that others' presence tends to increase arousal in most persons, and then that strengthens certain kinds of dominant responses. So it makes easy behaviors or well-learned things better, and it impairs difficult behaviors. Meaning that so things that you're kind of good at, or things that you tend to make more mistakes at, it increases those amount of mistakes because you're feeling more pressure, you're more concerned about other people looking at you. There's more opportunity for failures or for mistakes. Whereas when you're doing something that you're already good at, and especially for athletics, because athletics is more of a non-conscious kind of process. I mean, it's stuff that you've practiced for a long time, and you've worked at for a long time. It enhances our performance because it's stuff that we're already good at. And so that arousal just makes us more excited, can increase our confidence. Obviously, playing before a home crowd with a lot of people cheering for you, both when you do well and kind of hoping that you do well, that can increase your performance as well. So that's the basic. It's a basic outline of social facilitation. We're around other people. It increases arousal and it strengthens the dominant, our own dominant responses, either enhancing easy behaviors or decreasing, increasing difficult behaviors or making more mistakes, essentially. So as I was talking about before, social facilitation is an obvious explanation for the home advantage that you see in different sports. Home teams win approximately 6 out of 10 games, and this is across different types of sports, whether it's baseball, basketball, soccer, football, whatever it might be. So, and this seems to be an advantage is larger. The advantage that people experience in these cases is larger for teamwork-focused sports. So it seems to be the case that when you are on a team sport, being in front of a large group is actually more helpful. It's not as helpful for more individually focused sports such as golf. This is amazingly constant over time and across different sports. There are other possible contributing factors that may be influencing. One is the officiating bias. There's also evidence that shows that referees tend to favor the home team and to give more penalties to the visiting team. Also, travel fatigue. Whenever you have to go to a different place to play, usually you're traveling or you're changing the hours of time that you're actually playing, so that can have an effect. We're most familiar with our home context. I mean, we kind of understand what the stadium's like or what the seating arrangement like. We know more people there. And then, of course, the home team crowd noise disruption. If you've ever watched like a Seattle Seahawks game or a Kansas City Chiefs game, they have kind of those decibel meters, and those decibel meters keep going up and up in a negative way for the opposing team or the visiting team when they're trying to perform well. So here's just the overall team. You can see that for each of these different kinds of sports, baseball, football, hockey, basketball, and soccer, the percentage for all is over 50% of home games that are actually won. And this has been studied. See, as you can see, this is several different hundreds of thousands or several different tens of thousands of different games that have shown how this percentage actually works. The next issue is crowding. And this is what we were talking about earlier. Crowding is when you have a very large group of people. So not just a smaller group of people. Remember that a group is anything two or more. But whenever you have kind of a very large group, like hundreds or thousands of people, it can have a different sort of effect. So the effects of other person's presence increases with their number. So the larger the number of people there are, the bigger the potential influence they may have on our behavior. So large audiences can interfere with even well-learned or automatic behaviors. When you're in a crowd, it also tends to intensify positive or negative reactions. So when persons sit close together, friendly people are liked even more, and unfriendly people are actually disliked even more. And so this goes back to that same idea of it being in the presence of people intensifies current feelings, and then with the crowding influence, it increases that even more. So when you're at, say, like a home game, and you're around other fans, you tend to have a certain sort of feeling. There's more of a sense of a camaraderie. And people tend to form kind of quick friendships or a little bit more forgiving of other people. But then when you think about, like, you're at a home game and then someone from the opposite team is also sitting in the stands. And what can happen is there can be a lot more negative attitudes thrown towards those people. Just the fact that they're wearing a jersey that's different than the dominant one, they'll hear more jeers. Whereas if you weren't in that stadium and you weren't in the presence of all those people who were actually on the home team, probably the case that nobody would be saying anything. So if you're just out and about, and if you see someone in a jersey that's different from you, typically you're not going to feel that same kind of sense of wanting to say something, or not as many people would say things towards that other person. Fun shared with others is more energizing, and this goes back to that idea of it increases the arousals when you're at a crowd. And then crowding has a similar effect to being observed by a crowd. It enhances the arousal. So one of the kind of interesting questions is, why is it the case that we are aroused when we're around other people? What is going on for us psychologically that has an effect on that? So it could be the fact that the enhancement of dominant responses is strongest when people think that they are being evaluated. And this is what is known as evaluation apprehension. It's the concern for how others are evaluating us. And a good example of this, of course, is going back to the idea of standing up and giving a speech, say for a class, in front of in front of a bunch of people. One of the reasons that this may be difficult is it can cause evaluation apprehension, meaning we're concerned about what other persons are thinking about us. Maybe more than anything, how is our teacher or our instructor actually judging us or thinking about what it is that we're doing. And so that arousal plus already being concerned about how we're being evaluated just kind of increases the amount of cognitive load and can make it more difficult for us to actually speak in front of others. We're also driven by a distraction. So when we wonder how co-actors are doing or how an audience is reacting, we become more distracted, and this causes arousal. So that increase in cognitive load makes actually less room for us to think clearly, which also creates more anxiety, and it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. So the mere presence of others can be arousing even when we are not evaluated or distracted. Now, the other interesting thing is there may be some kind of innate social arousal mechanism that occurs just from being in groups. If you look at other mammals, most mammals, or a much larger group of mammals, tend to be in groups or packs. And there is something that happens when you have a pack mentality that's different from when persons are alone or when animals are just alone. And so there may be something innate, there may be something about our own evolved social psychology that just makes it kind of a natural innate mechanism that when we're around other people, we immediately become more aroused or more excited. And that could just be part of our own evolutionary heritage. So the concept of social loafing is in some ways slightly different than social facilitation, meaning that social loafing is beginning to think about what happens when people get into a group and actually do less, or does the group sometimes influence persons to decrease their performance or decrease their effort? So when we think about social facilitation, it usually occurs when people work towards individual goals, and when those individual goals or when the efforts associated with those goals can actually be evaluated. So what happens on the other side of that when people pool their efforts towards a common goal and yet individuals are not necessarily accountable for their efforts? And probably several of you have had the experience of working on a student project, and student projects kind of go one of two ways. Either they go great because you find the right person, you find someone who's actually as committed as you are, and you both go towards a common goal, or you end up with someone who doesn't put forward the same type of performance, and you have to end up doing most of the work while they simply follow along. So that idea of when you're in a group and someone does less than what's expected of them is this idea of social loafing, doing less when you're in a group. So when you look at collective effort in these types of examples, we often see that the effort of the group as a whole is less than the sum of the individual parts. So group members may be less motivated in certain types of additive tasks when they're just adding to what everyone else is doing. They tend to not do as much. Probably kind of an example of this is a tug of war. When you have several people pulling in the same direction, and so you have more of a additive sort of effect, and people tend to pull less when they're simply adding to what everyone's doing. And if you've ever tried to move furniture with someone with like a big group of people, and it's the way in which that one person doesn't seem, as you're trying to move a couch or something, there's one person who just isn't having to lift as much or even trying to lift as much as everyone else. And that's this idea of social loafing. So the definition of social loafing is the tendency for people to exert less effort when they pool their effort towards a common goal than when they're individually accountable for their particular effort. And then the effort decreases as group size increases. So the more people you have in a group, the more people you have who will exert less effort rather than more effort. And this brings about this idea, or what we see in these kinds of situations, are what are called free riders. Free riders. And these free riders are people who benefit from the group but give little in return. So this is a overview of several different studies, 49 studies to be exact, and then actually 4,000 different participants. And this kind of looked at kind of this process of social loafing. Social loafing. Because as you increase the group size, so going from 0 up until 15 or 16, what you see is the effort decreases, thus the social loafing increases, and it increases in relationship to the group size. So once again, this kind of creates for us two different types of situations that can happen in a group, either social facilitation or social loafing. In the presence of others, when individual efforts are evaluated and there's a certain amount of evaluation apprehension, it can increase arousal and then actually lead to social facilitation, so an increase in effort. Whereas when individual efforts are pooled and not evaluated, and thus there's no evaluation apprehension, which decreases arousal, that can often lead to social loafing. So in terms of when social loafing can happen during everyday life, there's a lot of workplace group experiments that it shows that employees produce more when their individual performance was posted. So when you're being observed and when there's some type of an evaluation, and especially when that evaluation is going to be known by others, a lot of that gets back into reputational concerns. Then that actually increases your performance. Social loafing is also evident in a lot of different types of cultures, and it kind of changes based on the cultural values. Social loafing also appears in donations of money and time, and so persons will change how much, either the amount that they will give based on how anonymous they can be in terms of their money or their time. Now, persons tend to loaf less when the task is challenging. So when the task is more difficult, when that task is more appealing, so it kind of if it kind of intersects with a person's individual values and things that they really care about, or the task is more involving, so you're more kind of actively doing something about it. Groups also loaf less when their members are friends, or when they feel identified with or indispensable to the group. So when you do a group project with your friend, because there's other social facilitation going on with friendship, I mean, you can't, after a group project is done, the friendship doesn't stop. And so you know that there's potential problems that could arise in your friendship if you don't contribute the same amount. That can actually lead to kind of decreasing the amount of loafing. And then two, when you feel identified, and so this is where in a lot of workplaces people will be identified for what they're doing, given certain kind of rewards, either monetary or otherwise. And then two, if bosses and people in charge can really kind of accentuate the contributions of their workers and really show how indispensable they are to the group, that can also help to decrease loafing as well.